Hello and welcome to Sundays with Survivors featuring Manny Korman. Thank you to those who are here with us today and those viewing this recording. If you've seen my programs before, you know I always give a loving shout out to my amazing and wonderful parents, Eddie and Lori, as always. And if you know them, you know why I do that. I'd also like to extend a very special thank you to all of the survivors and their family members who have shared their testimonies with us, especially today's guest, Manny Korman, who I will be introducing to you shortly. My name is Michael Mantell. I'm a therapist, educator, and 3G, the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, Alice Diamond from Sătămăr, Romania, and Mickey Mendelovich from Sighet, Romania. In their memories, and to combat Jew hatred and Holocaust denial and distortions, I began hosting and producing these programs. In October 2020, with the help of Andrea Bolander, I launched the Sundays with Survivors program, the first of which featured Holocaust survivor Roth of blessed memory. I added more Holocaust education programs, including Mondays Among the Nations, 2D Tuesdays, and 3G Thursdays, because I love alliteration. Each featured non-Jewish allies and children and grandchildren of survivors. And I added more programs that cultivate Jewish pride and combat Jew hatred. I'm grateful and proud to say that we are going 4 years strong and counting. It is now my honor to introduce our featured guest, Manny Korman. This will be a short introduction since Manny will share more details in his testimony. Born in Hamburg, Germany in 1931, Manny Korman was 6 years old when he and his family were arrested and deported to Poland, along with thousands of other Jewish families. There they were placed in horse stables among other locations before Manny and his brother Gerd were separated from their parents. Only years later did the brothers make it to the United States to be reunited with family. In this program, Manny will talk about his life before, during, and after the Holocaust. Throughout Manny's presentation, we invite you to write your questions or comments in the chat. And at the end of Manny's presentation, we will open up the program for Q&A. No matter how incredible these programs are, and thank God they always are, your participation at the end of the program adds so much more meaning and value. At that time, please feel free to raise your virtual hand for me to call on you, or unmute yourself to ask your questions directly, or I can share your questions and comments that you write in the chat. And just a few announcements before we begin, because we have 5 very wonderful programs in December, pretty much back to back, and I hope you will save the date and join us for one or all of them. On Monday, December 9th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Shale Horowitz will be leading a program called Why Fair-Minded People Should Support Israel. He will take us through the common accusations and distortions from the anti-Israel side and clearly and concisely debunk each of them. On Tuesday, December 10th, I will be co-hosting a very special 2G Tuesdays documentary film screening in Manhasset Island in New York. The film Family Treasures Lost and Found follows journalist Karen A. Frankel as she unravels her parents' secret, riveting stories of survival during the Holocaust. The film screening will be in person only. The screening will be followed by a Q&A with Karen and the film's director, Marcia Rock. The Q&A portion of this program will be available in person and via Zoom. And on Wednesday, December 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join me and 3GNY for a conversation with author and 3G Brooke Randall to celebrate the release of her new memoir titled Also Here, Love, Literacy, and the Legacy of the Holocaust. On Sunday, December 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join me for a unique Sundays with Survivors featuring Ted Comet, the spouse of Holocaust survivor Shoshana Comet of blessed memory. In that program, Ted will share Shoshana's Holocaust testimony through a visual tour of 5 larger-than-life tapestries created in the late 1960s by his wife. These tapestries were recently on loan for an exhibit at the Center for Jewish History, which just closed last month. And through the lens of these unique works of art and Shoshana's story, Ted explores the themes of Holocaust history, trauma, psychological repair, and an affirmation of life. And finally, on Monday, December 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time via Zoom, please join me for a very special program featuring Charlotte Porchak, the international senior educator at Stand With Us, who will be speaking about the dueling narratives of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The presentation will show the major differences in how each side views and relates to the history and current events, and highlight the divide that needs to be bridged to achieve a lasting peace. As you can see, there's a lot of exciting programming on the horizon, and I hope you can join me for one or all of them. And with that, I want to once again thank you all for being here and your continued support of these programs. And again, thank and welcome Manny Korman. Manny, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is the my uncle Oswald Laufer, who was my mother's brother, and he lived in the town of Elberfeld, Germany, where my mother was born. And he was 28 years old when he was killed by the Nazis. He was in an organization that was fighting the Nazi regime in Elberfeld, and he was arrested a few days before he was assassinated, put into the local jail in Elberfeld, and then released. And on the way back, he was followed by some Nazi police or Gestapo agents, and they shot him in front of his parents' house. And he died on the 7th of March, 1933. So for the Korman family, this was the initial experience of having some situation that functions with a Hitler regime. And so I just wanted you to see that because I think it's important for you to know all the pieces that went into this. So I was born in Hamburg, Germany on December 21, 1931. I was born into a family of a brother who was 2.5 years older than I, and my mother and father. We lived in Hamburg, Germany. My father was a shoe salesman, and we lived a very normal middle-class life. And here you have some pictures of my family, which is my left, my mother and that brother who was killed when she was a young girl and he was a young fellow. The middle picture is my mother and father when they were engaged. They met at some railroad station in Germany. I always say my father did a pickup. And the portion of the picture you see on my right is my mother as a young girl. The next pictures are my mother, my brother, and I at a beach in Hamburg, Germany. Even though you see the grass there, it was really a beach. My mom and dad when my brother was born, and my brother is in the other picture with a soccer ball in his hand, which you can't see because of the pictures in there, unless you can. The picture you see on that building you see on the upper left, that was the building that I went to school and my brother went to school. I only went to kindergarten. My brother was older than I, is older than I, and he had gone to that school for a while. It was a Jewish day school. This building, it was called the Talmud Torah Schule, and it was attached to a synagogue called Bornplatz. And the rabbi of that synagogue was Joseph Karlebach. Let's see why I can't move this. And so the school building is now part of Hamburg University. And in 1991, my brother and I returned to Hamburg, Germany. And in this building, there is a dedication to the school that once existed, the Talmud Torah Schule, with a sign-in book. And I had the chutzpah to sign in and say, you try to get rid of me, I'm back. And so that was in that trip in 1931, in 1991. The building that you just see there, that was my synagogue. That was the Baumplatz Synagogue. It was a gorgeous place. And it was destroyed on Kristallnacht, as so many other synagogues and edifices of the Jewish world were destroyed at that time. So everything was fine with the Korman family from 1933 on, even though my uncle was killed, and until October 28th, 1938. October 28th, 1938, which was a Friday, there was a knock on our door at 7 o'clock in the morning, and there was a policeman outside. In fact, it was the local policeman who used to walk the beat and knew the kids of the street that we lived on, Bainstrasse 5. The policeman said, you have about 30 to 45 minutes to each pack a little bag, and you will follow me to the local police station. And so we did exactly as we were told. And we then accompanied this policeman to the local police station. And from the local police station, where we met many families such as we, who were also collected that day, we were taken to the Hamburg jail, a jail in Hamburg. And there they separated mothers with children from husbands and fathers. And that Friday, we didn't know for the entire day exactly what was happening to my father, nor did he know what was happening to us. And until the evening, and then in the evening, the German world, the authorities put us back on trucks and took us to the Hauptbahnhof, the main railroad station of Hamburg, Germany. And my mother, my brother, and I were told, as other people were told, as other women and their children were told, to go down to the platform of the railroad station. And there we met my father. And there was a train waiting for us. The windows of the train were open about 3 or 4 inches, and they were locked in place. And we had basically no clue of what was happening to us, but we certainly were with a lot of people who were picked up that morning the way we were. So the map you see there is what happened to us in terms of transportation to Poland. So we were in Hamburg, Germany, as you can see on the map, and that train headed east. And so when we went onto that train, we were just told to find seats, which we did. It was interesting, as we walked through the cars, we met one of our distant relatives who had a Kiddush cup, a wine goblet in his hand, and he was making Kiddush because it was Friday night. And it was the beginning of the Sabbath. And in the Jewish world, the night before always starts the holiday, and the holiday ends the night thereafter. And so that's why he was making Kiddush on the train. And that's why I think that the German government was sent us out on a Friday, because they really wanted to make life miserable for those of us who functioned religiously on a Friday night and a Saturday. And they put us on a train on a Friday night. And so the train left Hamburg, Germany, and moved east, southeast, as you see from the map, and made some stops along the way. And at one of the stops, my mother, for some reason, had either a postcard in a pocketbook, a blank postcard, or a letter, whatever she had. And she wrote a card to her parents. And when we got into one of the stations, one of the stops, she noted that there was a a worker on the platform, and she called to him and asked him to take the letter. She was able to put a hand out that little opening that they had, and he came over and took this postcard or whatever she wrote on. Um, and as the train pulled out, he tore it into little pieces and threw it away. So that's what we were dealing with. The train kept going east, and on Saturday morning, it stopped in the town of Neubenchen, the last uh, German town before the Polish border. There, we were told to get off the train, and which we did, and we were told to march to the Polish border. And as we marched to the Polish border with the Germans in back of us with weapons, um, when we got to the border, which there's always a no man's land between the two, um, the on the other side there were some Polish um, soldiers with guns, but not a major military group. And my father said to us, "Stay back," which we did. And suddenly somebody ran across and went to the other side, and everybody followed suit. And not a shot was fired that this little kid remembered at that time, certainly. Um, and so we were now in Poland. Uh, the Polish government really didn't know that we were coming. Um, the Germans made a decision to pick up Polish Jews, which is what they did, families, um, because the Polish government had made an announcement to Polish citizens who were living in Germany that they have X number of days to return to Poland, otherwise they will lose their citizenship. And it makes it somewhat obvious that the German government took advantage of that as another way of getting rid of Jews. Um, they accelerated the departure by picking us up on that morning and shipping us out. And so if you look at the arrows that are all over the map there, that's where people were coming from, all heading to Poland. And so we got to Poland. The Polish government really didn't know we were arriving. And so to give us some shelter, they took horses out of stables and put humans in. They put some straw on the floor. They gave a pot or two to every family, and that pot or two was used for everything but the kitchen sink, I guess. Um, and so that's where we were set up. And organizations in Poland, in Spongin, did get together and did provide food for us, throwing stuff off trucks that we were catching and whatever it was. But I certainly don't remember ever feeling that I was starving or not being taken care of. But I'm sure my mother and father made sure that I was taken care of. And so as well as my brother. But we met some people in the horse stables whom my father knew from being a shoe salesman and being on the road and some customers. And so we did get to know some other people who were so involved. And then they moved us from the horse stables to a building called Die Mühle, the windmill. And it was much bigger, and they set up cots and mattresses on the floor, and it was a very open space. And so that's where we were set up with other families. My father, as a result of his being Polish, was able to move around Spongin, um, and was given permission to move around, and even to the point where he rented a room from a shochet, a guy who killed chickens and ducks in a kosher fashion. Um, and so my father took that room, and then he was hoping that the family would be able to leave that the Mühle at some time, so we would function as a family. And that did happen, and they permitted my mother, my brother, and I to leave. And my father had, knowing that we were going to be released to be able to go out, was found a room on a farm in a little town right outside of Spongin called Odvotsk. No, not Odvotsk, Nonya. And in Nonya, there was a farmhouse, and they rented a room to my father, and it was one big room with one double bed on one side and one double bed on the other side. And that's where we lived for a time period. And so to move fast forward, um, we lived in that situation. Um, and so let me take you to April of 1939. It was Passover of 1939, and my father and all other heads of households were told by the German government that they should return to Germany. They could return to Germany to take care of the apartments that we were in, the cars we left in garages, the bank accounts that were in banks. And so in the intermediate days of Passover of April 1939, my father and other people such as he went to Germany to take care of the household, because if you remember, we were picked up at 7 o'clock in the morning. It was just put a key in the door, close the door, and just follow the policeman. Now, my father was there, and he and others such as he, to take care of all those items that I had mentioned before. And so my father did exactly what he was supposed to do. And so he took care of that. And while in Hamburg, Germany, he gets a letter from a friend of his who was once his partner in business, who was in the United States at that point, and who sent him a letter with a boarding permit, an entry permit to go into Havana, Cuba. And so I don't know how my mother and father communicated, but the decision had to be made. Does my father take advantage of that and go to Cuba, or does he come back to Poland and be with the family? The decision was made, don't know how it was made, but that my father would go to Cuba. And so in May of 19, let me see if I can move this, May of 1939, having trouble moving my picture here. There we go. In May of 1939, my father went on board a ship called the St. Louis. And that arrangement was made with my father making contact with somebody whom my parents knew who were not Jewish, who were part of the Hapag line, which were in charge of the ship, the St. Louis. And the St. Louis was heading for Cuba. And so this gentleman helped my father get passage on that ship. And my father and hundreds of other people went on that ship in Hamburg, Germany. And the ship was heading for Havana, Cuba. And when the ship got to Havana, Cuba, the Cuban government announced to the captain of the ship and to the passengers that they cannot get off the ship. The passengers would not be accepted, and the entry permits would not be recognized. Only people who had legitimate Cuban documents could come into Havana. And so the captain of the ship had to decide what to do, because he did not want to take the 900, little less than 900 people back to the European mainland, knowing that it's ominous for the Jewish world to go back into German hands. And so he was told that he had to leave Cuban waters, which he did, and he moved about 70 miles, a little northeast to the United States, and he ended up in the Miami waters and made contact with the American government, at which time um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president, and Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State. And he asked for the right for these people to leave the ship and enter the United States, even though they didn't have visas. And the American government said no to that. In fact, they insisted that the captain take the ship out of American waters and go into international waters. And the captain did that. He made contact with South American countries. There was a no. I understand he made contact with Canada. There was a no. And he finally received permission to land the ship in Belgium. And there were 4 countries that were willing to accept the passengers of that ship. And it was Belgium, France, Holland, and England. My father ended up in Holland. I don't know what the selection process was, but some people ended up in Holland, some in Belgium, some in France, and some in England. Would have been nice if he ended up in England, but that didn't happen. And so my father is now in Holland. Let me leave my father in Holland and now take you back to Poland, because my mother, my brother, and I are in Poland, and my mother recognized that she has to find a way of getting her children out of Poland. And so she investigated what was possible, and she found out that there was some kind of program which we call today the Kindertransport program, which was based on a decision that the British government made in the Parliament made in November of 1938. And that decision was that they would accept 10,000 children from the European mainland into England, ages approximately 4 to about 17, no parents, only children. And so my mother signed us up for that. There was some possibility of going to Palestine. My mother signed us up for whatever was possible, whatever came first, we would go. And so the British government of the Kindertransport, as we know it today, came in first, and my mother said yes to our going to England. So for her children to go to England, it required all kinds of paperwork, of course. And then my brother and I were taken by my mother to the local railroad station in Spongin, going back to Spongin. And that was in June of 1939. And she had to put her children on the train, not knowing if she'll ever see us again. And that was true of all the parents who put their children on the train at that point. And so I was not a very nice kid in terms of being accommodating to my mother's desire to make us, to put us on the Kindertransport. And so I refused to go, and I climbed a tree and I wouldn't come down. This was a 7-year-old kid doing all kinds of antics to avoid being shipped out from his mother, even though my brother would be going with me. So my mother had a bargain with me, which she did, and it was having a suit made and for my brother and me, and we would go, and she did that. She did all that. I don't know how she did it, but she did all that. And I came down off the tree and I said I would go, and so in June of 1939, my mother accompanied her children to the railroad station, and as other parents did as well, and put us on the train. And there were representatives from that program who accompanied us to Warsaw, and from Warsaw, they took us to a town called Odvodsk, which is at that time, and may still be today, a resort for the population of Warsaw. And so we ended up in that setting, and there were about 60 people who were involved in that, 60 children who were involved in that. This is a picture of the youngsters who were all in, they were collected in Otvatsk. And so this guy here, where my arrow is, that's my brother. That little guy behind him is me. And I'm going to point out this fellow here with a cap on his head, whose name is Joseph Camille, and he became a very important part of our relationship. The three of us really became great buddies, and I will indicate that as we go on. But these people were all Kindertransport kids, all whose families put them on the train and sent them to Otvatsk. And so we were waiting for a ship to take us to England. And that trip was supposed to happen in July of 1939. And there had been two previous Kindertransport trips out of Poland. Most of them came out of Czechoslovakia, Germany, and Austria. The Polish ones were few and far between. There were 3 of them, and there were 60 of us here. And we were supposed to leave in July of 1939. July came and went, and we were now in August of 1939. And the interesting thing was, as you look at timetables, September 1, 1939, the German government declared war on Poland. So this group of youngsters was sitting in Otvatsk in August of 1939, and it wasn't until toward the end of August 1939 that the leadership of the organization that was running this camp for us, or this collection of young people, indicated that we would be leaving on about 24, 25 of August. On 24 of August, they collected us and they read the names of the kids who would be leaving. I was called right at the beginning of the list, and my brother, who didn't hear his name, was already wondering what is he going to do if my name is called and his is not called. Well, that kind of ended when his name was called toward the end of the list. And so we were heading for England. The next day, or 2 days later, we left Otvatsk, went back to Warsaw, and there was obvious at the railroad station that war was imminent. Soldiers on horseback, which was a big deal in those years, a cavalry, and a lot of activity of the military crowd. But there was a train ready to take us, and it was on that railroad station in Warsaw that Joseph Camille, who I pointed out to, his mother had come to Warsaw because she was not sure she should send her child on the Kindertransport to England. This was a very ultra Orthodox family. Joseph had lost his father to natural causes in Spongine. Just had a heart attack, from what I remember, of what I was told. So she came to take him off the train and on the train, and she finally let him go when somebody said, "I'll put my kid on you." But so he came on board the train, as did all the other kids. And the train headed west and ended up in Gdynia. Gdynia is a port city of Poland and still is today a major port city of Poland. And the train went to Gdynia. And then in Gdynia, we were put on this ship, the Warszawa, which is a Polish ship, which went out to the North Sea and then landed in England. In England, we were taken from the train and we were taken to a large hall where the families that were willing to accept us to their homes would be waiting. One of the stipulations of the Parliament decision of 1938, November 38, was that families would be found to accept these kids before they arrived. And so these families were there, and we were all assigned to the families, and my brother and I were assigned to one family, and Joseph was to another family. Well, Joseph, my brother and I developed a rather very strong relationship, as I indicated before, on board the ship. At the end of the train ride and aboard the ship, Joseph kind of liked the idea. I was exactly his age, and I had this older brother who was kind of caring for us and watching over us. And so when we found out that he was going somewhere else, Joseph cried and I cried, and then the family that accepted my brother and me accepted Joseph, and so we all went to the same place. And so we were now in England. And a few days later, like September 1, war broke out. By the way, we had been registered in schools, in Jewish day schools. And so the three of us went to the Jewish day school, and we were with this family. And then September 1, war breaks out. And about 2 weeks later, the British government decides that all school children of London will be evacuated to the countryside. And so we had just arrived, just assigned to these parents, these people, these adults, these families, and now we're moving again. And so we ended up leaving this Jewish day school, leaving London and going into a little town called Tallaton, Talaton, which is a totally Christian environment. And the families in Tallaton had been prepared in advance, and they too had accepted children. And when we got there, my brother and I were assigned to two ladies, a mother and her daughter, Polly Gosling and Ruth Gosling. Ruth Gosling was the daughter, Polly was the mother. And so my brother and I were accepted by them. Joseph was going somewhere else. Joseph cried, I cried. Polly Gosling and Ruth Gosling said they'll take the three of us. And so we ended up with those ladies. And we were then registered in the local school. It was a two-room schoolhouse, one for the lower grades, one for the upper grades. When we went from London to Tallaton, we were accompanied by a Mr. Cohen, a teacher from London, to be with us. And he taught the upper grades, and there was a kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher in Tallaton who taught the lower grades. Joseph and I were in the lower grades. My brother was in the upper grades. So now we were living with the Goslings. We went to school, and so we're now set there. So we have my father in Holland. My brother and I are now in England. Let's go back to Poland, because when my mother put my brother and me on the train to go to Warsaw, she then knew that she better decide what's going to happen to her. And so she was given permission to leave Poland to go to Germany. She went to be with her parents in Elberfeld, Germany. And she then wanted to find ways of coming to the United States. And so what she did was she made contact. She needed a visa. And so she made contact with her uncle. She had an uncle in New York and in Miami Beach, Florida. So she wrote him and asked him for a visa, and she got no answer. And so she sent another letter and got no answer. So she decided what she better do is to write to a first cousin who had the same uncle. And that's what she did, and asked him to visit the uncle and tell him how desperate she is for a visa. Otherwise, she will definitely not survive. And so her cousin, Jack Mannis, went to see the uncle, and the uncle says, after Jack told him what the story was, says, I don't know what you're talking about. I never received a letter from Rosa. So he immediately sent a visa, and we found out that someone in the uncle's family found those letters before he got them, read what my mother asked for, and tore them up because that person was concerned that my mother would be a financial burden, could be a financial burden on their family. And so that never, they never sent, they never let the uncle know. And so the uncle did not know about sending a visa, but he finally sent a visa. So my mother, having a visa, was able to get a ticket to come to the United States through that same gentleman who got my father a ticket to come to Havana, Cuba. And so she ended up going to Genoa, Italy. And from Genoa, Italy, she boarded a United States ship, which took her to the United States. There was some talk between my parents of my mother visiting my father in Holland. My father told her not to do that. And so she headed directly to the United States and arrived in the United States in April of 1940. She was greeted there by a member of the family, but my mother spoke no English. And in time, my mother did find work as a housekeeper, full-time housekeeper, in a little town, Long Island, called Great Neck, where I now live. And I always say, I wish I could tell my mother that I live in the same town she became a housekeeper. So my mother was safe in the United States. My brother and I were safe in England, and my father was in Holland. So my mother, once she got to the United States, wanted her children. And so the whole question of how does she get her children to the United States? And so by chance, my mother had another brother who had gone to England in 1937, 38. He left Germany after his parents kind of nudged him to leave Germany because they didn't want to happen to him what happened to his brother when he was assassinated in 1933. And so he came to England, and he ended up in what was called Camp Kitchener. The British government collected people who came from Germany into Kitchener, and to get out of Kitchener camp, one of the things he could do is to join the army. And so my uncle volunteered to join the army. They changed his name from Zali Laufer, Solomon Laufer, to John Lawson, because they did not want a Jewish guy to be caught by the Nazi regime if there was war, and find him to be Jewish. And so my uncle carried that name for the rest of his life. But he was important to us because when he had fought in Dunkirk and Calais, which was a disaster for the British government in terms of war, war battles, but he did come to see us in Devonshire, in Telleton, England. And the pictures you see on the screen right now are my brother and I and Joseph in Telleton, England. So we were, as you can see, well taken care of by these Christian families who watched over us as youngsters who were shipped out from Germany and from Poland and came from Poland to England. So my uncle made arrangements. He somehow made arrangements for visas for my brother and me. And so we left, my brother and I left Joseph and the Gosling family at the end of August 1939. Sorry, the end of August 1940. And we went to London, and there we had visas to get to the United States, and we boarded a ship called the Cameronia, and there was an adult, a husband and wife, a mother and father or whatever, were responsible for my brother and me, but somehow we never got to see them. We just vanished all over the ship, and we kind of took care of ourselves. But so we left England on September 1, 1940, and ended up in the United States on September 10, 1940, where my mother greeted us. And the first thing out of my mouth to my mother was, "Did you bring my trains?" And of course she said, no, I didn't bring your trains. And the trains were something I had in our apartment in Hamburg, Germany, which ran through the house. And the last thing we're going to have is my trains coming to the United States with my mother. And there was a problem in terms of my mother now working in Great Neck, which was a live-in housekeeper, and she had one day off a week. So my brother and I ended up living with different families for quite a few years. Actually, we're 3 different families we lived with. The first family was a family we knew from Hamburg, Germany. After some time, they decided they didn't want us. Then we went to another family, and they then moved from Richmond Street in Brooklyn to Florida. And so we ended up with another family, and we stayed with that family for quite a few years. So we're in the United States. We're going to school. My mother's in the United States. She's working in Great Neck. My father is still in Holland. And the German government invaded Holland in the early 40s. And so my father ended up in a concentration camp, which was a shipping camp called Camp Westerbork. And Camp Westerbork was the setting that all Jews of Holland ended up going to before they were shipped to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and places of that nature. Anne Frank was a good example of that. Anne Frank went through that. So for some reason, my father was never shipped out from Camp Westerbork. The only thing we can think about in my family is, and we never really asked my father, and in retrospect, it's amazing that we didn't, what caused him to be saved. My father was multilingual, very smart, and was able to speak sufficient number of languages. I am sure that the German government, that the German Nazi crowd decided that he would be useful in terms of communicating with the people who were there. That's the only thing I can think of. My brother and I did have the opportunity to speak to a gentleman who, at the age of 18, was in Camp Westerbork, and he was never shipped out. And he was never shipped out because his father trained him to be a locksmith. And so, as a locksmith, the Nazi regime decided, good to have around. And then in April of 1945, the Canadian government went into Camp Westerbork and freed that camp. And then my father was a free man. And my father then made contact with us with a written document, a letter. He knew my mother's last address, and so that worked. And it wasn't until June of 1945 that we were able to speak to my father. Long distance phone calls in those years were not what they are today. You had to make appointments and you had to make arrangements and all kinds of stuff. And so it ended up that we had this appointment for a Sunday morning in the month of June of 45. And so we spoke to my father. And that was the first time we heard his voice since April of 1939. And it took until July of 1946 to my father arrive in the United States. He, let's see if we can move this thing. He ended up accompanying some hidden children who were hidden during World War II in Holland, and then were freed. So my father was on the ship that came to the United States. Okay, yeah, on this. It was a cargo ship which went to Mobile, Alabama, and one young fellow here was hidden, and this young fellow was a hidden child. I don't know what the adult world was about, but they were on that ship, and they landed in Mobile, Alabama, and then they ended up coming to Penn Station in New York in July of 1946. And so in July of 1946, we met my father at the railroad station. And so for my father and for us, it was like meeting somebody not totally new, but quite new, because I was all of 7, was the last time I saw my father. And now I am, that was 1939, and now we're in 1946, which is another 7 years on top of that. So I was now 14. My father did not experience a bar mitzvah of either son, but he did make it to the United States in July of 1946. And that's when the family came together for the first time since 1939. And that's the Korman story.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Manny. You weave an incredible story of 4 family members. You're one family unit at one point, and then the 4 of you are growing separately and coming back together as a family unit. It's very amazing. And the fact that you remember all of these dates and share it so beautifully, it's incredible. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Manny, what happened to your friend?
There we go. Thank you.
What happened to your friend?
Let me just introduce you. That's my father and mother. That's Eddie and Lori.
Okay. So you want to know what happened to Joseph Camille?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, he's a fascinating story, and thank you for asking that question. Joseph Camille stayed with these 2 ladies right through the war. His mother and 2 sisters, they had ended up in Russia, I think, during World War II. And in 1945, Joseph was informed that his mother and sisters were alive. And in 1947, his mother came to England. She was out of the DP world. So mother wanted her child. And the child was not so sure he wanted his mother, because he had not, just think, he left his mother in August of 1939, and we're now talking about 1947. So Joseph was a wee bit older, and his relationship with these two ladies was just unbelievable. And so he was not so sure about going to his mother. And the Jewish authorities finally stepped in and indicated that Joseph had to do that, had to go to his mother, because one of the requirements, as far as I know, of the November 1938 British Parliament law was that if the parents showed up, they have a right to their child. And so that made a lot of sense. And so the pressure from the Jewish authorities finally convinced Joseph that he had to go to his mother. And so slowly but surely that happened. So Joseph went from Telleton to London to see his mother, and then went back to Telleton. And somewhere along the way that switched, and Joseph went to live with his mother and went to visit the ladies in Telleton. Joseph became a very successful businessman in London, and Joseph took care of those two ladies in Telleton, England, for the rest of their lives. Joseph got married, married a girl from the Reform movement, and however, his children and grandchildren, whom I met not too long ago for the first time, are all Orthodox Jews. And so that worked out for Joseph's mother no end. She was thrilled to death with that concept. And Joseph died at the age of 62 of prostate cancer, and he left us kind of early. My brother and I did get to see Joseph in London a few times, and my brother had contact with his children as well.
Thank you for the question, Dad, and thank you, Manny, for that answer. That brings up a number of questions that I have. Before I call on Karen, who has her hand raised, I just want to ask, since you were essentially like now three brothers with Joseph, what was it like for you guys to split? Sure.
I can tell you that I, being youngish at the time of splitting, I didn't have it didn't have the impact on me that it should have had, but it had some impact on me. It was tough leaving Joseph. For my brother, it was much more difficult than for me, because he had this feeling of being in charge, of responsible, and so on and so forth. And my brother, who's alive today, always says there isn't a day that goes by that he doesn't think of Joseph and the impact that that separation had on him. So that was difficult. The fact that we were able to contact and keep that contact was great. If I may, I can tell you a little side story to that family story. 2 years ago, my brother and I and my son and daughter-in-law and my brother and some of his children and in-laws, we ended up going to Telleton, England. The reason we went to Telleton, England is that someone in that town wrote a play about the Kindertransport kids who ended up in Telleton. And that happened because my brother wrote a book called Nightmare's Fairy Tale. And in that book, he mentions Telleton. And so someone who knew the town of Telleton and knew as a teacher of theater in that town, called that guy up and said, you know, there's a book out that mentions Telleton with Kindertransport kids. You may be interested. That guy was so interested that he called my brother and said to my brother he'd like permission to use information from the book because he wants to write a play about the Kindertransport kids who were in Telleton, England. And he did that. He wrote a play, which my family and my brother's family and Joseph's family went to see in April of 2022. And it was an unbelievable experience. Joseph's family's kids who live in London came with a car full of kosher food because we were there for a weekend. And on a Saturday at lunch, the group of us who came from London and from the United States had a Shabbos lunch with the kosher food from Joseph's family. And the town of Telleton, for the first time, you can be sure, heard Birkat Hamazon being sung by a group of people who came to visit Telleton. So that was an amazing experience. And the Joseph's family and our family is now locked together, and they now attend simchas all over the place in both families. So that's what's happening in our family.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Karen, you have your virtual hand raised, so I'll give you the floor.
Hi there. Thank you so much. And Manny, thank you for sharing your amazing story. One thing that struck me throughout listening to you was that both in England, but also when you came to the US, there were so many families that were willing to open their homes to kids they didn't know and just figure out how to help. And I wonder if today that same kind of thing would happen. Having teenage boys of my own, I can't imagine taking in somebody else's teenage boys. It would be very hard. Kids, 7 to 14 is such a kind of crazy age for kids, right? They're changing so much and just so much going on that I wonder if you have any thoughts on, why people were so willing and how they were able to manage that even.
Well, World War II certainly motivated that. Would people do it today? I think given a set of circumstances, if explained correctly, they would do it today. But it's difficult to answer that question. I know that the people in England there, they just opened their doors. It was just unbelievable. And the Jewish community was, they set us up in their Jewish day schools. They did everything for us. And they were very cognizant of the possibility that we would never see our parents again. And there were many children who fell into that category, not seeing their parents again or seeing their parents under totally different circumstances. Some kids even found out that they really didn't like their parents, and so on and so. So it's amazing. But I think the war had much to do with that, and the fact that it happened in England twice. It happened in London, and it happened in Devonshire, in two different societies: the Jewish Society of London and the Christian Society of Telleton. And the Christian world just opened their doors to us and took such good care of us. It was unbelievable. Some adopted. We have stories of kids whose parents didn't show up. They were adopted by the Christian families in Telleton. We know that.
Thank you, Manny. And thank you for the question. A couple, we have a lot of questions, so if we can keep on going. And Manny, you tell me when you want to cut us off, because I think we can go for a little while. Can you talk a little bit about what part Judaism played in your life and your family's life before, during, and after the Holocaust? And if it did play a part, and it sounds like it did, how you were able to keep that up, being away from your family, particularly while you were in a predominantly Christian village?
Yeah, that's interesting. So in Hamburg, Germany, we were members of Bornplatz Synagogue with a Rabbi Karlebach, a major guy, and so we were in Jewish day schools. And so Hamburg, Germany was just a Jewish world. In fact, we ended up living in the area that we lived in because the German government moved us from another part of Hamburg, Germany, to be closer to the synagogue, moved the Jewish families closer to the synagogue. So in Germany, it was crystal clear. When we went throughout our travels, certainly in Poland, the Judaism kept up because we were with mother and father, and they were all Jewish families together, and so on. So we even made a Seder in April of 1939 in Poland. So that certainly happened. When we got to England, we started in a Jewish day school, and we were with Jewish families, but that was short shrift was made of that, and we ended up in this Christian society. However, Mr. Cohen, who came with us, did have Saturday morning services in the school, if my memory serves me right. So there was some connection. Also, my brother, being 3.5 years older than I, had a much deeper commitment than I, who was 7, to that whole Jewish world. Enough to tell you that living in this Christian household in April of 1940, which was Passover for us, that family, that Christian family, made contact with London, and we got matzahs and other foods, no wine, which you can expect. And my brother, who was by that time 11, was versed well enough to run a Seder for all the Kindertransport kids in Devonshire, in Telleton, England. So that happened, and that mother and daughter helped us get that stuff. And my brother was very conscious of that, and that Passover was there, and it had to be celebrated. And so it happened.
It's amazing. Your brother, just 3 years and change older than you, was taking on such a role. It's incredible.
Yes. Well, he was given this responsibility by my mother as we got on the train in Spongine to go to Warsaw. My mother said to him, "Take care of Manfred." I mean, can you imagine 10.5-year-old kid have to listen to that nonsense? He's got to take care of a kid. Well, he did. He was pretty tough.
Amazing. Kimberly, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for sharing your story with us today. It's quite enlightening and a special moment for me to hear it. I found out about this session last week in a college parents group, and having lived through the worst time in modern Jewish history and seeing what's happening now across the country, does it bring up some old feelings? And what kind of advice would you give to students and parents of college students who are grappling with some of the same feelings that you might have had growing up during the 1930s and 40s?
Tough question. So I've been asked this question before. First thing is students on a college campus, Jewish kids on college campus, have to be well versed in the history, especially of Israel, and the development of that creation before they go to campus. If they don't have the information, they're lost. Their battle is non-existent. So I certainly believe that our Jewish kids need to be trained in before they go to college campus, and parents can't just think it's okay. And they have to have some understanding of the other side, some consciousness of there's another side to this story that they may not like and they don't have an experience of, but we need to know that before we can argue a good case. So that's one of the things. Anti-Semitism has been around a long time, and it's going to be around a long time. What's happening on the college campus? I think university leadership has to have a different approach to how to handle campus situations. I was never a president of a college, but I was a principal of a school in my lifetime. And I do know that there are decisions you could make which would offer less of controversy than we sometimes see. But politically, I'm going to stay out of that because that's not where I belong. But there are real need for education and understanding.
Thank you, Manny. I'll echo that. I think to combat Jew hatred, we have to cultivate Jewish pride. And I believe you do that through understanding who we are as a people, reclaiming our story, reclaiming our narrative, and understanding that. So when people tell us what they believe we are, we can say, no, this is exactly who I am as a Jew. Thank you. And Kimberly, thank you for that question. I think, Manny, echoing your sentiment, college campus administrators and leadership have to do a better job.
Yep.
We have a lot more questions. Some people put them in the chat, shared before the program. And one question sort of along the line with Kimberly about anti-Semitism. You were relatively young at the time, but can you tell us a little bit more about your and your family's experience with anti-Semitism before the Holocaust? I mean, you talk about your uncle being murdered in 1933, and then 1938, there was this change, but maybe some experiences that you know about or had yourself?
I tell you, for me, there is no memory of the kids on the street whom I played with were anti-Semitic that I knew of or know of. So I lived a kind of sheltered life in that sense. For my parents, I'm sure it was totally different. My father not being German, not having the citizenry, which so on and so forth, certainly added another dimension to his life in Germany. But he was a successful salesman, and we did have a very middle-class household and lived a very nice life. However, there were signals that said things are not going to be so easy, because when I'm sure, and I wasn't aware of it, but when they moved us from one place and said you have to live in an area such as this, that was certainly an indicator that things are not so hot in town. So my brother is more conscious of it than I. So I didn't feel that. But once they started to put me into jail at the age of 6.5 and ship me out, I mean, there I became conscious of what had just happened. You may be interested in knowing that about 6 months ago, I became a citizen of Germany for the first time in my life. And I decided to do that because I said, you kept me out of that for my entire life. You're not going to screw me out of it now if I can get it. And so I did that. My son did that. And my two grandchildren did that in New York. My son in Brazil didn't do that, but my son in New York did. Yeah.
That's amazing to know. I know that's an internal struggle for a lot of people, especially Holocaust survivors and children of survivors who talk about reclaiming their citizenship from these countries,
Well,
whether
it's more than reclaiming. I could never get it. And my father could never get it because you had to be from a German background, right? Generation to generation. So we could stand on our heads. They wouldn't give us citizenship. We tried this game plan of trying to get citizenship just for the hell of it to see if it was possible years ago. And there was no way. Then suddenly the change occurred and I got it.
Amazing. To follow again about your uncle Oswald, knowing that he had become a local leader of a militant anti-Nazi group,
Right.
there was some awareness of what's going on in the late 20s, early 30s. Did your family ever attempt to leave Germany before the Holocaust?
My father was a Zionist from day one. He most probably would have left immediately if he had the opportunity, but he had a wife and two children, and the wife had parents in Germany, and she was not so ready to leave town. As it happens, as you can imagine, as crazy as the Korman family story is, we survived. We came together and we started our life again, and so many families did not have that opportunity. So we were fortunate in that sense, but only my father really was the guy who wanted to leave town. I don't know about my grandparents who lived in Elberfeld, Germany, my mother's parents.
And you were a refugee in the Kindertransport going to England, and then also, I guess, an immigrant going into the United States, still at a very
Yes.
young age.
Yes.
When you went to England, I assume you didn't know any English. What was that experience like acclimating to England?
That's
And
so interesting. I knew no English. My brother, at the age of 10, when he was still in school in Hamburg at Schule, he started to learn English. So he came with a very limited vocabulary. And I have to tell you, especially once we went out to Telleton in the countryside, you had no choice. Most 99% of the population was English speaking and not German speaking. So we kind of joined the crowd. And I came to the United States speaking a better English than a German. There's no doubt about that. With a German accent, but other than that, or an English accent, some combination thereof.
And then what was your experience like being a young boy in America, in the United States, in New York?
Well, there was kids made fun of me in terms of my various accents. And I was a pretty messed up kid at that time. I mean, I was a nail biter, a bedwetter, a thumb sucker, and a stutterer until my father arrived in the United States and everything went back to normal. So it wasn't obvious to a lot of people of the crap that I went through and that was going through, but it was certainly part of my life. Emotionally, I was screwed up. I functioned in school and I functioned otherwise, and I played on the street, but I certainly stuttered my way through all that stuff. So when a teacher asked me to read in elementary school out loud, it was never without stuttering. And so on the report card, I got a needs improvement.
We still have a handful of questions. So you and your brothers were reunited with your parents, your mother after, I think, a year or two, your father after 7 years. So what was it like for this family to come back together?
It was unbelievable. For my brother, it was a totally different experience because he could now give up the responsibility of his brother. Now it's mother and father all in the same household. It's not his gig anymore. And so that gave him some freedom upstairs in his brain cells. And for me, I love the idea of being part of a family and being with my family. And the whole Jewish world, my father, one of the things when he arrived, my father was a Talmid Chacham in the true sense of the word, of the words. He was just well versed in that world as well as in the secular world. But boy, it was Friday nights. I can give you an example. My first Friday night with my father in the United States, we found a sublet. That's in those years there was no apartments for rent because it was wartime and then post-war and soldiers coming back. There were no apartments available. So we ate sublet from a gentleman in a building in East New York, Brooklyn, not far from, right near where my brother and I spent some time with another family. And so first Friday night, I thought I'd do what I always do, is go out after dinner and go play with the kids. And my father says, "Where are you going?" He said, "No, no, no, no. We study the portion of the week." End of discussion. That took care of Friday nights. But that gives you an idea of my father, whatever he went through and how much he went through, his Judaism in terms of transmitting that to his children was full time. There was no fooling around with that.
It's beautiful. Bella, you have your hand raised, so give you floor.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and it's incredible. It really is incredible, Manny, to hear your story and your family's story. And it's wonderful that your immediate family was reunited here, and you guys were able to continue. And it sounds like you were able to instill a lot of the same values and love for Judaism and our people in your kids, and continue that. Which I also wanted to ask you how your experience affected you as a parent when your turn came to be a parent, a Jewish parent. And I also just wanted to ask how your wife's family how they fared.
So my wife's family, her mother was born, my mother-in-law was born in the United States. My father-in-law was born in Hungary, and he came to the United States in 1923 or 24. And so my wife's experience in terms of the Holocaust was non-existent, other than what she learned from the press and from her parents and from members of my father-in-law's family who lost their life during World War II. But she did come from a household that was quite Jewish, quite participating in the Jewish world. And so I think that's one of the things that most probably attracted us, that we had that in common. And somehow it ended up into my children's life, especially my younger guy, whose wife is a rabbi in the trained by the Jewish Theological Seminary, and his daughter is now a student in rabbinic school of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And that doesn't fit my son's persona, but it certainly fits the rest of his family's persona. And so they're participants. I have another son and his family living in Rio de Janeiro. That's a different world, but it's a Jewish world.
Bella, thank you for that question. And I see you brought somebody else with you to the Zoom. So thank you for sharing this with another generation.
It's my daughter, and I've had her here on mute to listen as well. I think it's very important to hear. Hey. To hear.
Hi.
Oh, and another one. Thank you guys for being here. Wow,
Yes.
how beautiful.
Yes, we have two in the background listening.
Amen. Thank you so much for being here. Manny, I'm going to ask a few more questions.
Okay.
That's okay with you. How and when did you learn about your family's testimony? I know your parents had slightly different stories, but how did you come to know them?
Actually, my father's testimony was interesting. I was married already, did not have children at the time, but my wife and I were at my parents' house on a Friday night, and something triggered my father to talk. And I had never heard a rather, other than this happened, but just phrases and so on and so forth. My father was much more detailed that Friday night in terms of his journey and so on and so forth. So that was pretty clear. And my mother was always straight up in terms of what happened to her, in terms of going from Germany to Genoa, and from Genoa to the United States, and so on and so forth. But my mother was most probably the key person in saving all of us. She convinced my father to go to the United States, to go to Havana, even though that didn't work. In the long run, that worked. I mean, strange way to work, but it worked. She had the audacity to put her children on a Kindertransport, not knowing if she'll ever see her kids again. That's pretty gutsy, and very clear as to what was important in her life. Hopeful that she would survive, but not sure. Yeah.
Another question from an attendee, I think it was, I don't remember who asked it, but did you learn about what happened to the rest of your mother's family or your extended family?
We know what happened to my mother's family because this plaque that you saw of my uncle being memorialized in Elberfeld, my brother had everything to do with that. My brother's an American historian and a Holocaust scholar. And so he did his homework with the town of Elberfeld. And there is a Holocaust center in Elberfeld, Germany. And my brother made contact with the people there. And we ended up not only going to the event that memorialized my uncle in Elberfeld, but we were given a tour of that place. And my brother and I, prior to that, had decided we were going to take a trip to that covered the route of how we were traveled when we traveled out from New York, from Hamburg, Germany to Poland, and so on and so forth. So we ended up in 91, starting in Hamburg, Germany, going into Poland, all illegal, and then going into Holland. And then we did a side trip to Prague. And we ended up in England. So we took a trip covering what we went through as kids, and got a bit of knowledge of the journey, because we ended up in this Camp Westerbork, which had information about people who were killed, not people who survived. The Germans are very good at keeping detailed information, all about the people who were killed or shipped out to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and so on and so forth, but not what happened to the people who survived. But we spotted a few pictures which were out there of people whom we met in New York, who were camp partners of my father, and who then, after the war, came to New York, and they became a social setting of the group that came from Camp Westerbork to New York. So part of our history came from that.
And a lot of people helped in your rescue and saving you and your family during this time, including the people in England, and I believe helping your father gain passage on the St. Louis. Were any of these people ever recognized as righteous among the nations?
I'm not sure. I can tell you that my mother, who had this uncle of ours who took care of, who was in the British Army, after the war, she went to see my uncle. And she went to Tallaghton, England, to say thank you to Ruth Gosling and her mother. I don't think they were ever recognized in terms of the righteous crowd. But I'm not conversant with the other people of that group.
Another question. It seems like letter writing and correspondences between you and your parents were a lifesaver for you and your brother. And your brother, in his book, shares of the letters. He writes
Yes.
what was written in them. How did these letters survive, and do you still have them?
We have, which my brother did. He was a professor at Cornell, and so he put what is called the unpublished Korman papers in the archives of Cornell University. So that's where that stuff is hanging out.
And there's a story about one of the letters I believe your mother wrote from New York that made its way to England, but the way she wrote the address, do you mind sharing that? I learned about it.
Yeah, Miss Cottage, I forget the exact wording, but the postman was smart enough to know where to take that, because they knew where the foreign kids, the German kids were from, the Kindertransport kids were from, and so the postman delivered it to Miss Gosling, Ruth Gosling, because he just assumed that was where it should go.
So your mother thought Rosa Cottage was a person's name, send it to Miss Cottage.
That's right, Miss Cottage.
Beautiful story, and the fact that it made
Great
its way
story.
there is
Great
wonderful.
story.
So I'll just ask from Lauren, asks, what did you learn from surviving, and how can we apply that to our lives today?
Well, that's always an interesting question. It certainly changed my personality from what it would have been had I been grown up in Hamburg, Germany. I take things seriously when I really think they deserve to be taken seriously. I don't get caught up in trivia of making that very important in my life. I'm an optimist, which some of you may find strange, but I'm an optimist. And my niece only reminded me a couple of days ago. So was my mother an optimist, and that's true. Both my mother and I look for the good things. We kind of avoided spending time on the bad things. I won't say that to be true about my brother and my father. My brother, who was much more affected by these events than I was, has a less optimistic concept of life than I do. But my brother had 4 children. He lost one. He's got 14 grandchildren, and he's up to 17 great-grandchildren. So he certainly knows how to deliver a family. I have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. But even with all that joy of life and so on and so forth all around him, he still has some hang-ups with what happened during the war. And I understand it. His responsibilities were different. His just being 3.5 years older than I was different, and his responsibilities. But he's a great guy.
And I just want to say that your story again is incredible, and you share it so beautifully. I know you're celebrating, I believe, 93 on December 21st.
That's correct.
Yeah, so all I can say is I wish you a happy and healthy. And as my father says, may you live to 120 and feel 20. You have
Say it the right way.
Go for it, Dad.
It's Ad Me'avesrim, Kmo Esrim. You can translate it now.
Yeah, may you live to 120 and feel 20 and be like 20.
I'll try for that.
I mean, when I met you in person, your energy is absolutely incredible. It's so lively and youthful. You are an incredible human being, and people have been sharing that with me throughout the chats. And it's incredible for you to share your story with us. I thank you. You talk about the Kindertransport and also the St. Louis. These are very important parts of Holocaust history, and I believe everyone should learn about it. But also your brother's book is incredible testimony to your whole entire family and really outlines a lot. It's incredible what he was able to put inside this book. Manny, I want to thank you so much for your time, for your testimony, for everything you do. I want to thank everyone for being here. And again, you have a beautiful choice of 1 to 5 different programs come December. I'll share more about that in our follow-up email.
Okay.
Manny,
So
thank you.
I want everybody to know that Michael and I met at the Holocaust Center in Glen Cove, and a discussion just started, and that's how this ended up being part of his program. So I thank Michael.
Thank you, Manny. You're amazing. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.